So, Andrew Campos,
What's up, man?
I feel like on the last episode, not that I hogged the mic, but I think the beginning of kind of my time in Boulder was very, it was a long time before I had, one of my best friends, Andrew Campos, move out to Boulder. And so I kind of want to take this time during this episode to talk about you.
Okay, I'm down.
Yeah?
For
You
sure.
cool with that?
Yeah.
All right.
My
Sick.
little journey out here, I guess you could say.
It was a journey. You
Yeah.
learned a lot about, inclement weather.
Well, what do
and
you
stuff.
want to know exactly? Like maybe like from the get go, or like, I guess just the
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, okay, you were on the way to somewhere, and why don't you explain the
Yeah.
thought process behind that?
which I think is funny because I've met so many people that have like been in a similar experience, right? So I coming from California. I was driving out to New York. And the reason why I was driving is because I had two big dogs, both about like 75, 80-pound range. And so I just didn't really trust the kind of air transportation for my dogs at the time. So I was like, why not? Like, we're moving across the country to New York. Like, let's make a cool trip out of it.
Was it that, or was it that you didn't trust your dogs on the air transportation?
I think it's both. It's
Yeah,
both,
yeah.
really. I mean,
I
there
love his
are
dogs.
other ways to transport your pets over long distances. There's like actual like van services, but
Who knew?
I just I didn't really trust it, and I didn't trust my dogs. In particular, one, he would have definitely been freaking out the whole time. So I'm sure there are plenty of dog owners that understand where I'm coming from. Anyway, so I'm, driving, going to New York, and my buddy that I was going to meet out there, who had already been living out there for a little bit, was like, hey man, you're going to get here in like the winter time anyway. The winters out here, like they're fun, they're okay, but what do you think about hitting a mountain town for like some seasonal work? And he was like, what do you think about Colorado? And I had already known some people out here, such as you, right? So Colorado was kind of like a perfect spot, being that it is not only like almost like a halfway point as far as driving, but also I know some people out here, and the idea of working in a mountain town sounded really fun. Not only being able to make some money, but also, have some fun, snowboard, ski, that type of thing, and really just experience, coming from Southern California, experience an actual winter.
Yeah.
So
how was which mountain town?
Yeah. So ended up settling down in Vail. I think we were really wanted to be in Aspen because there was coming from, we were both bartenders in that scene, right? So there was a couple spots in Aspen that we were looking at in particular, but it was in all of it, it was just any sort of mountain town in Vail or in Colorado. So we stuck on Vail, and ended up having an awesome time out there. Made a great amount of money, especially for just a seasonal job. It was kind of difficult figuring out the housing. I'll say that. It was
I was
very
just gonna
difficult.
ask actually, how was that navigating
God.
sort of
It was ridiculous.
that landscape?
Because Vail's a village, right? It's literally called Vail Village. It's tiny. So with that, there's multi-million-dollar homes out there, and then there's a big portion of the renting side that is specifically reserved for foreign workers that come in. They call them J1s.
Yeah.
So then there's also that you kind of have to deal with as far as, availability or opportunity. Luckily enough, I found a spot in Minturn, which is like 5 minutes down the road, a tiny little town, cool spot that I just lived in like a studio basically. Didn't end up working out for my dogs. Had to have them stay with some people in Boulder, which had its own total side story of issues with that. But I guess getting back to the main point, spent the winter out there. It was fun. Made a lot of friends. And, you know, during that time, of course, reaching out to you and other friends that I knew that were kind of scattered around Colorado. And that's when you had approached me with, you know, the idea and kind of the project of what you were trying to get into.
Yeah. Quixotic.
Yeah, Quixotic, you know, trying to essentially open up. I think it's better to call it a third space as opposed to just a bar.
Yeah.
'Cause, you know,
Yeah.
people just
Third
think of,
place,
like,
a hospitality concept.
right, there you go.
I don't know.
I
I
think
like
that's a good
I like
one.
to keep it in that realm of like
Right.
hospitality.
'Cause I
But
think when you say just bar, there's kind of a certain connotation to that as being like, oh, just some place to go drink. You know?
stigma.
Right. There's a stigma behind
of
it. And being that I come from that background, hospitality background, you know, the more and more we talked about it, it seemed definitely something that I wouldn't mind doing. And I figured, like, New York's not going anywhere. That's still on the bucket list down the road.
Hell yeah.
Would love to still venture on down there for sure. But I saw, you know, an interesting opportunity here to kind of push the bounds or like the envelope of what I'm normally used to doing. And it resonated in the fact of, like I said, it's like kind of, it's really falls into what I do anyway, right? Which is hospitality, bartending.
Yeah. So I was
serving
just
that.
gonna ask, is like, do you kind of stick to one particular thing, or do you venture out? Because I kind of know the answer, right? It's probably that there is a sort of coming up and working your way into certain roles, and it depends on the establishment, I'm sure. But I'd like to kind of hear your take and your own sort of
like
journey. You know, did you start off as a busser or?
In hospitality, it's strange. There is a general window, I guess you could say, or I don't want to say limit, but there's a pocket that most people have experienced, right? It's like whether you're in college or straight out of high school, like a lot of people tend to get into some sort of restaurant or hospitality job because it's very easy to like work with hours with your schedule with school or with something else that you might have going on. Even if you work, you know, let's say outside of like being a college student, just like a young adult and having a full-time job, you know, most restaurants, bars, you can get a job, just a part-time on the weekend, right? So it's an easy industry to get into, to have, you know, a certain degree of experience in, right? So like I started off, I think as like a host / busser, and then went into like back of the house, like prep work, cooking, and then got introduced into the bar, like what it is to bartend, but not at a restaurant. It was like a true bar. And that's where I found that I loved doing that type of stuff. Cause like cooking is one thing. I enjoy doing that, but man, it takes a certain type of person to be a full-time cook or a full-time chef. Yeah. It's a different ball game. Whereas front of the house, bartending, I love the social engagement. I love being able to create something for someone on the spot and have them watch me create it for them.
Yeah.
And then provide that service / creation, and kind of just, you know, it's an interesting organic flow of a social experience.
It's like an experiential sort of offering. And there's like totally that sensory marketing sort of point of view for me. I'm like, oh yeah, there's an aroma. There's so many different sort of variations of a drink.
Right.
And I think it's really kind of
it's
impressive.
drastically changed over the past like 20 to 30 years as far as, you know, what bartending is. So when I was going back to like that pocket of experience, right, that most people exist in, there is a view of a sort of plateau that happens. It's like, oh, like once you know, hit serving and bartending and all the things in between, you know, there's this like idea that there isn't really much more to go after that. And a little historical context to that as well. It's not maybe how it used to be. Like maybe back then in the 80s or 90s, you could be a full-time server like well into your 30s or even 40s, and you can make a living off of that. Where it's like now, like economic changes, it's a little bit different. You could still do that. It just depends on like where you're doing it. So this is where that plateau kind of expands, right? It's like whether or not you actually decide to make this, or make the decision that this is going to be your career path. And then it gets into like, okay, now you're taking the next step into whether it be, you know, fine dining service or fine dining sort of quality, or even like you're going into hotels and like banquet services. You want to be like a maitre d'. You know, that's when you really start, okay, you're stepping into that next level of what this industry is. So I guess wrapping it all back around to, you know, my journey out here in Colorado, there was a cool aspect of the residence that people have in nature, and like coming from a beach town, like, you know, loving the ocean or going on hikes and stuff. It was something that I was like, oh, this is cool. Like I love like the outdoors and whatnot, but there's also this kind of feeling of, you know, Colorado trying to figure out its scene as far as hospitality. And, you know, especially Denver, there's so many different types of, you know, bars and places. But there's a weird kind of swing to it, you know, being that it's such high elevation. There's a limited sense of agriculture out here. So people, you know, you have to get creative of like what you're working with, you know, from any sort of like chef's perspective.
I kind of tend to think that Denver has a relatively like kind of new sort of like not new in the sense of like culture or whatever. I think that the scene itself is up and coming. I think that Chicago and New York and LA, like those scenes have all been, you know, established a long time ago.
Right. And
so there's almost this high potential because there's a lot of sprawl, right? There's a lot of people moving here. So there's almost like this blank canvas. And I think that, you know, I think Denver recognizes that, and they're actively, you know, open to it. Right. And they seek it almost. And then I think as you go up, or even down, you know, Colorado Springs, but as you move out, that sort of openness, you know, despite the stigma around sort of bars, right? There's more to it. I think it's really the social sort of infrastructure.
Yeah, and it's important. I think that's, you know, going back to like why I stayed or why I'm still here. There, when you first talked to me about, you know, what you're trying to do with Quixotic in the bar, there was a skepticism, right, from my point of view. As a one, not only just like starting a business, but also being new to the state and just trying to and kind of seeing that scene established out here, and there is a sense of like progressiveness, I guess you could say. But on the flip side, it was because of that I was like, oh, I don't know, you know, we'll see. But understanding that like, oh, there really is like a good amount of potential out here. Like there's things set in place. There's a lot.
Even opportunity,
right? There's opportunity. And Colorado has like a lot of interesting factors as far as like business goes. You know, the amount of, you know, extremely successful businesses, like especially on the tech side, that come from out here. Like there's money out here is what I'm saying. Oh yeah, right?
There's a highly concentrated amount of wealth, and also high growth key industries that are kind of on the forefront of all the economic sort of dynamism that's taking place in Colorado. And I think it's important to get into that, but I think I'm going to push that off a little bit and get back to your own personal journey. So you know, I basically had told you I had this idea, right? And you were skeptical, which you should be. Everyone should be. You know, everyone has ideas. I think that this one wasn't really completely validated until the point you actually took up a job on Pearl Street. And
right.
So I wanted to ask you about your experience, and also if anything that I was talking about on the data side was being validated in the way that you actually validate.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the aspects. Well, I guess like, going back for a sec, you know, seeing the data, seeing everything that you had worked on, and realizing of kind of like I guess like a market gap, you could say there was for what we were trying to work on. And seeing everything, on screen is one thing, but I am like, being someone who loves bartending, I kind of need that in-person interaction, I guess you could
Yeah.
say. Maybe it's like a tangible thing.
So I think you
so
could even call it qualitative,
I guess,
right?
yeah.
So there's like quantitative, the data side, and then there's sort of like a qualitative or tangible
Right,
sort
because
of
my whole thing was like, okay, I see all
anecdotal.
this, but let me actually go out and like talk to people about this, because that's like where I get my convincing aspect from, right? Is like, okay, is this something, data can say a
Yeah.
lot. It can say a lot for sure, but actually hearing it from people is another thing entirely as well. So, worked at a couple spots off of Pearl Street.
What kind of spots, if you don't mind?
I don't know if I want to give the names out.
No,
yet.
don't do that. Don't do
I
that.
worked in one fine dining spot that was, I'll just say they were trying to go for their Michelin. So like it was up there. Had to dress proper, know the menu front to back. Like it was,
Yeah.
pretty high quality service. And for me, I'm always trying to improve on my skills. So I'm like, hell yeah, this is going to be awesome. I get to, tap into some of these other people that are, know what they're talking about in the spirit world and
Yeah.
the bartending world. So that was fun, but it was very interesting to hear how many people would either come in that were regulars or people that were coming for events, whether it be like a football game or some sort of like private event, at the restaurant itself. And just like it was funny how many times I heard it. It was like, hey, where do we go after? Like this is an amazing dinner, incredible food, awesome service, all that, but it's like we the night's not over. It's only 7 p.m. We're here to enjoy ourselves. Where do we go after?
And you were observing, and
I was observing. Yeah, I didn't really have that answer because I hadn't been there too long. But I'd tell them, oh, you can go here and there, and then after like being there for a little bit longer, and then transitioning to another bar, which was one of those places to go to after, right?
Yeah.
Even then, I was like, okay, well, yes, this place holds the space to have people come in and socialize, but the atmosphere that kind of surrounded that space was very odd. It's not what
this is the second place that
this
you're
is
at.
the second place, and it's not to say that it wasn't nice, like aesthetically pleasing, like really nice interior. They definitely did a great job on the build out, but as far as trying to tap into that aspect where you can cater to not only, there is it's a big college town, Boulder, right?
Mm-hmm.
So not only can you cater to these college kids and have a space for them to enjoy themselves, but also being that it was like more aesthetically pleasing than your local pub or your local dive bar, you have that potential truly to tap into people that are young adults that are outside of that, have been done with college or maybe even their master's program, and they didn't know how to hit that. It was so strange. I was always trying to figure it out.
Do you feel like they were trying, and then like at a certain point before you got there, like maybe that's what the goal was, and then they were like, all right, we got this easy target, right? And I think at first maybe it would have been, initially something like a fern bar, like one of those types of like kind of young, hip, kind of a diversity of space, right? But at the end of the day, it was a certain type of establishment, and it had its limitations just from the get-go.
I think, yes, I think that happened. I think it was, I'm just spitballing here. It seems like that was the initial maybe goal, and again based off of like how it looks in there, right? And their bev program is pretty nice. They got a pretty efficient bev program, some great delicious tasting cocktails. But what I think probably happened is that they noticed the college sprawl, I guess, and instead of trying to hone in and really cater to a community that very much so exists there, you know, really like the mid-20s to like 30s age.
Yeah.
I think they really tried to double down on this college sprawl, which is not a bad thing. It's not to say that you shouldn't do that. I mean, you know, down to business, you wanna be able to provide for
more units,
right? Right, but
more volume.
But
with that volume, what I mean from your perspective, because I think it's really important that you had that experience and you come in with that sort of experience. And so with that, is there a trade-off that's being made if you're kind of that young professional versus you're very like 21 or however old, like
well, there's
20s.
there's a shift throughout the night, right? And it's like a very, very sudden, like hard shift. It's like, okay, hey, lights are going down, like no more food.
Is it quick?
It's pretty quick, but there's a weird lull in between because those who like, you have your regulars that are chilling at the bar, you know, or people that are just enjoying their time there, like just immediately leave because one, it gets extremely loud. You could barely even hear yourself talk. You have to yell at people. And two, the entire menu changes. So like you're not allowed to get access to a lot of those like house cocktails that kind of make that bar or beverage program what it was or what it is, you know. And then it pretty much strictly caters to, you know, turn and burn, quick volume.
So it's almost momentary, or like it's almost like in that moment, boom, you're not the customer anymore. Almost. Because I mean, that's how I take it. I'm not in college.
It kind of is though. Yeah. Cause it's like, oh man, you know, you build up this cool rapport or, you know, relationship with this guest or this customer, and you're expressing yourself as a bartender.
Yeah.
And then like within an instant, it's like, hey, I'm sorry, I cannot provide the service that I was providing you anymore.
Yeah.
This is what we have to offer. And now I have to scream and yell at you.
Yeah.
Because I can't hear anything.
So it's like the customer journey is just like,
which I think part of that isn't really, I don't know if it's necessarily their fault, but the way that place is designed, there's no like little areas you can go and kind of isolate yourself.
Like a nook.
Yeah, no like nooks that you can kind of go and like, you know, it's not like this it's not like this place like unfolds into like other little spots that have their own little atmospheres, you know. It's like it's just one big kind of area, you know. It's like
a cafeteria kind of.
It reminds me of my like 8th grade dance, like in the cafeteria when it turns to the late night, and it's so funny because
it's so funny.
You see all these people, you know, because if you are honing in and like doubling down on the college kids, right, on the volume, then it's like, all right, hey, this turns into a club, like why not? Let's do it. But even then,
it's a long line at the punch.
Strange. It's like a long line at the beginning, and if upstairs is closed, yes, people will hang out downstairs, but it's all just a big open space. You can't really like go sit down anywhere. You can't really like get away from the extremely loud DJ noises to kind of just chill for a sec.
Yeah.
You know, it's a weird thing.
You can't take a break from it though.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily think that's, you know, I don't want to say like it's one person's fault or the other, whether it be like management or ownership. I think it's just the like the subsequent kind of issue that you're dealing with, you know, from the build out itself. So tying back to like what we were talking about earlier, you know, where do you go to after dinner and stuff?
A question that I've never had. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but
okay.
A question I've never had a problem with, because I'm on the other side, right? I'm asking my server, I'm asking my bartender, I'm like, hey, where's the next place? Right? It's something I love to do when I'm traveling, right? Because you get this unfiltered, great description of the next place to go. And it's from the opinion of somebody who, you know, gives a shit. Right. And I'd say that you not having that answer and then kind of realizing, oh, there isn't.
Is it really? Yeah, it's strange.
And I've never had that until
It's
I moved to
strange.
Boulder.
If
So
anything, I'll tell people, to go like, oh, there's this cocktail bar and there's this cocktail bar that are like, and this is me coming from a bartender experience. I'm like, you can get nice cocktails at these places.
yeah,
But as far as like experience for the guest, one spot is like tiny, and yes, there's a cool aesthetic vibe to it, almost like old, like, I don't want to say like Victorian, but almost, like dark wood, like a really like soft lighting, cool spot, but it's tiny. There's not really like any room to kind of dance. There are cool little nooks and places you can go, but it's like the nooks themselves, it's like you could fit maybe like 3 people at a table. And then you're spending, like, I don't know, $17 for a cocktail, which is a good cocktails, but okay, hey, you go grab a cocktail there, you go somewhere else. Well, there's other places, that also, again, great cocktails, but beyond that,
what's the value prop, right? What's the value
like
prop?
What's actually going on?
What's the brand? What's
the vibe?
Yeah,
Kind of,
yeah. And I always tend to go more like, all right, beyond the logo, beyond the name, what is it? And I think as hospitality is kind of, and I think just like generally, preferences have kind of changed over time. I think that that's more important than ever. And, I think that out here, it's kind of like all these places have been places the whole time, and they haven't really changed. And they haven't definitely gone through a remodel since the 1990s, but for a majority of them, not all of them. But I think the point that I'm trying to get to is just like that feeling, right? And that's a big thing for you, is that transcendence into a space, and also like having that space be the kind of thing that you gravitate towards, right? At the end of the night, everyone's like, where do we go? When I get my check in Boulder, it's kind of like this unnerving sort of like feeling. Right? I get the ick because I'm just like, fuck, we don't have any. And that's usually something that I look forward to in a different town.
Right. Yeah.
When the check comes and we're like,
strange.
we're all looking at each other, there's unwritten, unspoken sort of understanding of like, what could we do?
Yeah. It's funny you say that, because there have definitely been times where I'll like be closing out my check, and it's like, damn, I don't want to go home, but fuck, I don't want to go to anywhere else around here. It's like, I know if I go to the next spot, it's going to be the same. I'm going to feel exactly the same I felt at the spot previously. And then I'm just going to buy something out of spite or just boredom. And I'm like, oh, fuck, I don't like, why did I even spend that money? And then that ties into another weird aspect. Again, coming from a person who's a bartender, other places that I've lived, the bar scene, there's always been this cool like community that's not even like, pushed out on like the front. It's like, it's almost, it reminds me similar to that of like a skate scene. If anybody's ever been a skater, it's like, it's not about talk, or it's like I think of like Fight Club. We just watched this the other day. It's like, rule number 1, don't talk about Fight Club. It's not even like that crazy, but the whole sense of like having this cool subculture that it's not about like being cool or like, we're like exclusive. It's not about that at all. It's just like you resonate and you all have this sharing, and it is more like niche, and it's like it's exclusive but not exclusive. It's like
it's mutualism, right? It's having the same sort of shared sort of experience, but kind of different takes.
Didn't feel that in Boulder. It was so strange. There was maybe one other bartender at a different bar that would come in to the place I worked at, and he was like actually regular, and like a lot of people knew him, and I would see him when I'd go to the other place. But other than that, like I never saw any of the other bartenders out or come to the place that I worked at. And it was like the first time experiencing, a city that's pretty small, that should have some sort of cool subculture, at least within the bar community.
I mean,
or just the service community. Like, it was strange not really seeing that. And then so tying that back into like, oh, where do I go to after? Like at least in other places, even if it was like a more boring night, like historically speaking, you know, weekends before like big holidays, a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people are leaving. So it's going to be less vibrant. But even then I'm like, I know I can see my boy over here, you know, have some drinks, you know,
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
He might like be a wingman or something. And, you know,
So
there was a sense of like belonging or, you
yeah,
know,
yeah, yeah, yeah. But I mean, I think about so what you just said, like really, it kind of got me thinking about okay, like there is an industry culture, and in no way, shape, or form do I try and navigate it. I love living vicariously. I think through you and through all of your industry people, and just like seeing the continuity, even if it's across different places, right? And seeing that sort of mutualism and that that angst and like there's so many things about the industry and it varies, right? But the commonality is that you're in the service industry,
mm-hmm.
and there can be a hellish service at one place and there could be a fun service at the other, and you guys are still going to understand and want to talk about it, right? And there's a sense of mutualism that kind of unifies you guys. And I always think that's like so cool about that sort of subculture. And I did feel like, man, is it just me, or is there no like industry night or something that brings together
fucking industry night?
Yeah,
Shit.
right? It's not a hard ask.
It's not a hard ask at
But
all.
what is the
It's
what is the
interesting to
thing
see-
that kind of gets that rolling though? Like,
I mean, you got to cultivate first off for a place that for a community, city, town, whatever that doesn't have that's lacking. You got to cultivate, but with cultivation, you got to understand or at least make sure that there is a place for that, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Or a yearning, because you could see, you could go somewhere and see something from your own perspective that like, oh, this place could use this, or like this needs this, but it's like subconsciously maybe coming from your own bias of experience, right? And what you think might be better for this community. But it's another than to actually hear from people that do live there to get that confirmation of a need of something, right? Because if there's no true need of the people that actually live there or who have lived there for a long time, then it's like, okay, what are you cultivating? Boulder's a very interesting, weird city to do that with, because you have such a crazy polarization of demographics. You have an extremely wealthy demographic that lives there that probably has been there for a decent amount of time, probably a decade, maybe 2 decades.
Decades and decades.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
And then you have the total polarization, right? Which is the college kids coming from all different places throughout the nation, even throughout the world. And then you have like the middle, right? Which are people that are either like in their masters or like, I know we try and like stay away from this label, I guess, but young professionals.
Yeah.
Right.
I guess it's okay because we are that.
Right. But it's a lot of transplants.
So we can call each other that.
A lot of young professional transplants that are
they belong to high, key industries, high growth key industries,
right. Good purchasing
life
power
science,
are
great
key industries.
The only purchasing power.
Right.
Makes
and
up like
a lot of
50%.
them, there's that whole funny saying with like Colorado in general of like people come here to like escape their problems or lives.
Yeah.
And whether it's true or not, there are a lot of transplants and a lot of people, well-educated people, that are in key, like you said, key industries, solid careers.
Yep.
When you have that amount of people that move here, and then you don't really have an offering to like keep them here, there's more than just your work life and your physical fitness life, right?
Yeah.
It's not to shit on the physical fitness aspect of Boulder in particular. Like there's like a total bunch of Olympians that live out here. Like people are very much so on the health kick. And I think especially in this day and age is something to be proud of being, fit, and it adds to your mental fortitude, all that stuff. But one of my favorite quotes from the Robin Williams movie. I think it's Dead Poet Society is he huddles all of his students together, and he's a professor at like a private boys school.
Yeah.
And he's like explaining to them, like science, medicine, law, all these different careers and industries are noble pursuits, and they're essential for sustaining life. But then he goes to say, like, poetry, romance, art, music, love, those are what you stay alive for.
Yeah.
Right. So when you come to a town or a city that doesn't really offer something as far as creative expression, I guess you could say, that's outside, again, your running communities, or like your after work beer or whatever it might be,
Beards
dinner.
Beards and Brews place.
Yeah.
There's a lot of them.
It's interesting, and
do you think it's an outsider perspective, or like maybe somebody who's listening to this now is like, well, you're not culturally assimilated, or whatever, and it's like, yeah, but you could say that all you want, and I feel like when I moved out here, I was like promised sort of, or maybe it was a promise to myself that I was going to find sort of like a work-life balance. What I didn't get was that second half. I got the first half. I got work, right? Work is there.
Mm-hmm.
And, putting in work in the physical sort of aspect, or like out, getting doing a sort of 14 or anything even comparatively, like go hike Chautauqua, whatever. I feel like that's a part of life, but it doesn't, you could be an enthusiast all you want, or
right. Like my my identity, I guess, doesn't entirely lie in my physical fitness outings, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I find a lot of good experience. Like I was in the Marine Corps. I literally had some of the best sort of experiences when we were like kind of in the shit, or, like kind of suffering together, and it was sweaty and it was fun. We were just getting it on a hill. And like, sure, like I think about those times and it brings people together. And I think that's part of it. I think there's, the whole granola aspect. There's a lot of climbers, and there's a ton of like people who do bouldering like and everything.
Awesome. I used to climb back home,
We're not saying anything bad about that.
No.
But is there something missing?
It is like a good point to make, because I have had that conversation, right? Well, it's like, well, if you don't really take a lot of joy in these outdoor aspects, you probably shouldn't be living in Boulder.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, that's kind of an interesting take, because I do enjoy these things, but there's got to be something more, I don't.
Yeah.
There's another side of me too that truly enjoys social engagements that isn't outdoor running or climbing. Like that's a different sort of box that is checked when I do those activities, right?
100%.
And it's a different box that's checked when I'm out being like a social butterfly, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
It just sucks when it's like very limited. And it's interesting too, because I'm 28 now, working at a couple of these bars down in Pearl, meeting a lot of like the college kids, and meeting also those like young professionals that we're talking about, transplants.
Yeah.
It's interesting because the most that I've got from like that whole creative expression, right, comes a lot from these college kids that are, maybe like just on their senior year, or like going into their masters, maybe like 22, 23, whatever. And it's like, oh, wow, I can actually talk to you guys about, interesting topics. And and even with the other ones that are like more my age, it's like, yes, we'll get into like more serious topics of conversation for sure. But it's like, especially as a guy that's single.
Hear that, ladies?
I rarely actually came across other women that were my age that were also single at this bar that was supposedly one of the bars to go to. And like the times I did run across them, it was like, oh no, yeah, we're just like out because of so-and-so's birthday, or like, oh, like I'm married or something. And and more often than not, it wasn't that they didn't go out. It was that when they did choose to go out, it was not in Boulder. It was almost always out in Denver,
Bingo.
which was a very interesting, thing to hear too, which kind of pushed me towards working in Denver. So like I now work in Denver. I've been working in Denver for about a month and a half. Obviously Denver, it's like the biggest city in Colorado. So like, obviously there's going to be more to offer out there, but it's only like a 20-minute drive from Boulder, 25-minute, with traffic, probably like 30 minutes, depending on what part of Denver you're going to.
But you'd say that the offering is there, and it's interesting to have a conversation. I've always thought this was fascinating. So I'm like having conversations about not just the void, but I've had conversations about how the offering is better in Denver and what places we actually wanted to go to, or like we were planning on going to. So we're making these plans to literally leave the place that we're at, to go 20 minutes, an inconvenient Uber, super expensive. But I just find it ironic, right? The irony of creating plans to go somewhere else when, if you think about it, it's ridiculous. If you think about it from a market sort of perspective, like, okay, if the offering was here, people would go here.
Right. Because it's ridiculous with the type of people that live there, right? Yeah. That's my whole thing. Like, and going back to Boulder. What I was saying, and going back to what I was saying, it's like, oh, if there's not like a community that sees this need, then it's like then there is no need to make that change or put something in. But the fact that there are so many people that do live there, and like just looking up online, just different things we've come across too, as far as like, oh my god, like there's some crazy
I love
funny
Reddit.
things on Reddit about Boulder, and especially about the dating aspect from like your mid-20s to 30s, and there's so many times it's just like some commenter will be like, it doesn't exist. Like, they're
like, what's the best place as a single person in Boulder? They're like, Denver,
right? Or it'll be like, hey, there's a bike shop that's also a bar,
and you're like, trivia. Okay, cut out half of the people
like I love trivia, but man, when you have so many places that do trivia, it feels like a bingo night, and I'm not 60 years old.
Yeah. I love trivia just as much as any other young professional, but I think that
I like trivia as a casual, fun little game to play on like a Tuesday night after work, which is offered at so many places out here. Yeah. It's not that it's a bad thing. It's a fun thing, but holy shit. Is that the only thing you're riding on, or is like the only thing
it's again, so like think about it from the perspective of the owner, right? So if you're an owner in Boulder, this one's for you. So you were probably 55 up. If you're well established, like I can think of 4, you're probably, you own actually multiple, not single locations, multiple locations where you can then tap into the economy of scale, and you can kind of like do all the things that worked prior to the last couple years. And nobody would bat an eye. Everyone would be like, oh, this is great. And we're in this information age, right? Where everyone's starting to realize, oh, the same 4 dudes own everything.
Right.
So if vibrancy is low, right? Because it is. If vibrancy is low, the chamber that's out here, they say vibrancy like it's a fleeting thing. They say it so many times, and it's like repeat, repent, repeat, repent. It's here, I promise. And it's not. It's in my opinion, it's a loaded ass opinion, but it's not. And so I think it's funny that, we're talking about all these points, and I think it all kind of segues us into, asking ourselves the root cause analysis of how this happened and why it continues to happen.
Well, I love that you said that, because, maybe not so much on how it continues to happen, but maybe the how or the why. Talking to people that have been living here for decades, that are very much, established in what is Boulder. I've heard that at a time it was amazing. It was an awesome place to live. Like pre-COVID is really what I'm talking about. Seeing so many different things online with Boulder in particular, with COVID, and even then, in relative speaking, you know, there is that whole saying that the Boulder bubble, right?
Yeah.
Like Boulder
Yeah.
is its own crazy bubble that, you know, reality exists outside of it.
Yeah. It's 25 miles surrounded by reality, or square miles.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And talking to people that have lived here for, you know, a decade or more, you know, true, like locals, people that are actually established in Boulder,
Yeah.
saying like what it was like, and that it actually did have plenty of offerings and places and things to do, I guess you'd say. And then COVID, you know, something that none of us saw coming or could really do about it, you know, changed the game throughout the world. And so when you have a place like Boulder that is like known for like being in this bubble, right?
Yeah.
It's the impact might be more than maybe you would see to other towns of like a similar demographic, I guess, in the sense of, you know, how they pivoted
Yeah.
from COVID, right? And
Yeah.
so from now, you know, you see these places that maybe, you know, had the money to survive COVID,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And you know, we're in 2024, we're about to be in 2025. It's like we're past that, the whole thing of COVID, and it's just interesting to see what the hospitality has done about it, or hasn't done, I guess you
Yeah.
could say.
Yeah.
And yeah.
So I guess a lot of the things we talked about today can almost be like sort of circumvented or even prevented if there's a diversity of offering, right? So not just the same, whitewash taco place, right? Or like,
Yeah.
a different variation of that, right? But I mean, truly, people who are authentically passionate about what they do, and they have to, as a new entrant into the market, which is something that, I have been working on for the last year and a half, almost 2 years now. What I've noticed is that if the same sort of people, right, the same, let's say 4 people, if they kind of have a stronghold, I guess, on the market, which, it's hard to say that anyone has that power, right? But at least look at the facts. The facts are there are multiple locations, all owned by one umbrella that has one man on the top, right? There's a couple of them.
Right.
And so what happens is that if all of the knowledge goes up to one guy, there's a sort of, a thing that happens in markets where, there's sort of a preference change and everything else, right? And so the consumer starts to, develop different preferences. And over time, the market, in order to remain sort of competitive, has to have those new entrants, has to have disruption. And what happens when that doesn't happen is something that you can view firsthand when you walk on Pearl Street. And I think it's fascinating because that knowledge sharing, that sort of cross-pollination or pollination, right? The liminality, if you will, it doesn't happen as regularly as it would in places with even less of a population density, right? Like Santa Barbara, you could even make the sort of argument that, oh yeah, they're fairly similar. It's fairly similar to Boulder, but I have a way better time on State Street than I do on Pearl Street.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And maybe that's my anecdotal bullshit, but I can back it up with the data. If every, multiple locations are all owned by one guy, then that sort of continuity, it almost is like opposition at a certain point. It changes sort of the sort of subculture that would normally take place, right? There's nothing wrong with going and talking to other people within your industry. Actually, it should be promoted. Right. And here there's
something about competition that has its positivity in the business aspect, right?
Yeah.
Well, and then too, like, I don't know who these individuals are, but if you have if you have these individuals that own several locations and they had enough money to survive, there, I would I guess assume or make,
Make an inference.
make an inference that their concern isn't really like it would seem that they're just there to make money, which is
Yes.
not. Any business has to make money. That's how a business survives and thrives. But when you're in the hospitality industry, there's something to be said that there's certain places that stand out because of the experience that you give the guest.
Yeah.
And so when you take it from that side, or if you don't have that aspect of thought going into your business in this industry, it becomes stale,
Yeah.
And
Does it stem into sort of the work culture of that
oh
environment?
my gosh, very much so. Very much so. If you, especially in this, it's one thing to feel it in a corporate industry because corporations are so vast, and I have worked in the corporate side.
Yeah.
Where it's like you can have discontent with your overhead, but at the end of the day, it's like you can't really do much about it. Versus in a hospitality industry, and in particular with restaurants or bars that aren't chains, that aren't, corporations, or maybe they have multiple locations, but they're still localized.
Mm-hmm.
Like you very much so feel the tone that is set from the owners.
Is it complacency from the owner? Do you think because
Well, I think
you could
it's
set up shop on Pearl Street and make all your money with tourists? Like that's a easy sort of pickings, right? It's kind of like at a certain point, if you have all these locations and you have an operation that kind of runs itself and you can kind of get away after a certain amount of time without competition, you kind of want to remain the same. So you protect that a little bit, right?
Sure,
and
for
so
sure.
it's almost like,
and whether it's I like this phrase of unintended consequences, right? Unintentional consequences.
unintended consequences.
I think what I'm saying is not meant to be like saying these people are evil people or saying that they don't care, but I think when you are operating at that level and you can step away and let things, and you're getting your money, as a business owner, that's like really what you're going for anyway, right? As an entrepreneur, it's like you're there to make your money, right?
I don't even disagree. I think it's how you make your money, right? And I think in restaurants and bars are almost like a direct sort of vein into Main Street America. And when you have a place that, you have an establishment, right? You are a direct representation, I guess, of sort of the vibrancy and culture of your city and your locale, whatever. I think that there's an imperative to actually remain competitive. And also look at who lives in your city and who frequents all these places and who lives in the surrounding areas, right? Because Boulder's dealing with something pretty specific post-COVID, is that all these people who work in these high growth key industries, they're, especially the younger ones, and they have a cost benefit analysis that they have to make. And so they're choosing to live outside the city. Well, COVID happened, and now those people don't have to go to Boulder.
Right.
So now they're somewhere in the middle, right? They're
Right.
making all the money in a place that is, located in Boulder, and yet they're spending their money in Denver. Because that cost benefit analysis, whether subconscious or conscious of it,
Right.
we're making a decision of where we purchase. And I think Boulder's going to realize that, I said it on the last podcast, that the taxes aren't flattening out post-COVID like they should be. Dion spikes the crap out of it every time they have a game. But now you're relying on CU for everything, for all of your money. And so your ethos, your whole identity is starting to, just be the college.
Right. And whether that's unintentional, it's like, hey, that is awesome that, he's coming. But let's say like down the line, let's say he, cultivates one of the best college programs out there. It's still, like you said, you can't solely rely on that. There has to be other offerings too outside of that.
Or where do you go after the game?
Right, exactly. But that all blends it all together. And I think that's something that I've come across too, whereas people, get a little nervous, thinking like, oh, new entrant, like someone's gonna just take over everything. It's like, no, that's not the
The
approach
intent.
at all. It's when you add more variety and
Yeah,
like
you're
that competition. It's that whole
complimenting.
thing. It's like when everyone does well, everyone does well. But
Yeah,
when everyone is only like a limited amount of offerings where half of them share the same exact atmosphere.
yeah,
It's like, well, what are we really working with here?
yeah.
And it's a very interesting dynamic of energies that are kind of working in Boulder, and both on the business side and just the, I guess, I don't know, spiritual side, for lack of a better terms.
It's yeah, it's a feeling of sort of transcendence, I think, when
Right.
when you go into a place and you have for one, you're getting cared for, and that is kind of top down, right? The sort of care comes with, it doesn't come from complacency, or it
Mhm.
doesn't come from doing the same old thing over and over again, because that's monotony. And that stems into the customer experience. And I think one thing that is hard to really explain is something that actually Bijou Thomas, he did something like profoundly impactful for my up and coming sort of take on this industry. It was like, he took me to Denver, right? That's the first and foremost. Like, he was like, I'm going to show you something. He took me to like, I think we went to like 15 bars,
Oh, wow.
and we were bouncing to next bar, next bar, next bar. And every time we stopped, he was like, okay, take a look at the customer.
Right.
He was like, how many people are wearing denim? How many guys in their 20s and maybe early 30s are wearing denim jackets and snapbacks?
Right.
And I was like, okay, there's like, wow, there's actually quite a bit. And he's
Right.
like, great, now let's go to the next one. He's like, how many, like, what is the vibe on sort of the racial diversity here? It's a lot of young people. We were at Recess.
Oh, okay.
I'll say the bar because it's a great bar.
Mhm.
He was pointing out these things that you can't really articulate or explain, but it has to do with that sort of transcendence into a space, right? And it's the feeling. And that was something that was hard to quantify for me, but it was definitely something that everyone agreed on in Boulder, was that there was that lack of it. If there's 1.2 million people that travel into Boulder every single year, it's probably more, but 1.2 conservatively, you could go to the visitor data and actually see that, okay, how old are these people? What are they spending on? And, what's going on? And so the city pumps out all this data.
Mhm.
And it was kind of me doing my due diligence, trying to understand sort of the zeitgeist, understand the ecosystem. And I realized, holy crap, the events that we're throwing, there's a diminishing sort of local turnout, right? And that is sad. We need to do something about it. And I
Right.
think that's the point of this podcast. It's not to shit on Boulder,
No, and
but it's to point out the
it's to
problems so we
point
can
out things,
actually
right?
work on it.
Yeah, and I've had even conversations where people will get, almost insulted, being like, "Oh, well,
Yeah.
if you don't like it here, you don't have to live here."
Or
It's like,
leave.
no. It's like, that's not
No.
it's not at all what I'm saying. It's like, I love this area for the aspect of like people being, the physical fitness one is a huge one. It's like you surround yourself with people of like-mindedness, or, it's that whole thing of like, you are who, like, the sum of the 5 people that you surround
Yeah.
yourself with. So like that, pushing that is awesome. And like spiritual, like, openness is awesome. But there is a kind of weird, like, unspoken, like, dark side to this, like, health kick in in all aspects, where it's like, I've also met plenty of people that make plenty of money, have a solid job, take care of themselves physically, and at least try to mentally. But more often than not, I meet people of my age that are like incredibly lonely.
Yeah.
And I don't know the answer to that.
I think
But I think
we're hitting it.
Right. Well, like how you're saying, like, right, this podcast is to talk about these things, and it's not to like shit on by any means.
No.
It's just that whole unintended consequences,
Yeah.
right? Unintentional consequences.
Yeah.
And back to Denver and what Bijou showed you, it's like that's the beauty of it. Like the variety and diversity that you get of offerings.
Yeah.
It's like there is a place for everyone. And even with that saying, people might misinterpret or confuse that with being like, like increase development in Boulder and like make it bigger. And it's like, no. Like you can make it better without having to cross the lines of the preservation of what makes, Boulder this awesome destination location.
Yeah. And it is such a beautiful location. And so, we want to note that, like, we have quantified the sort of market demand. We have found the qualitative sort of approach as well, right? We see it for what it is. And now what is really preventing us from going forward is that we now just need to build community around our priority, right? Our priority is filling that void, not disrupting and taking down the establishment, right? It's that there is a quantifiable gap, and if you ignore it, and that gap happens to be the highest purchasing power and kind of what makes things feel alive, right? Whether it's the industry or the consumer or the customer, if you ignore that they exist, right? Those people are young. They're from the ages of right out of college all the way till about 44 even, right? I think 35 is that kind of like sweet spot around like 25 to 35. But you have all this indirect customer flow from the college kids and from sort of the older generation. We all want to be around that spirit, that spirit that we talk about, right? The feeling of sort of that transcendence. And if it's stale constantly and you don't really, pinpoint it with the data, right? You don't acknowledge that it exists and you ignore it. Well, eventually people are going to start making decisions to move along, and that gap doesn't get filled. But in 2022, right, post-COVID or around COVID, we were like top 10 in the United States for highest concentration of migration, even for millennials.
The last episode it was like 10,000 millennials.
Which it's like 26% of the population, right? If you ignore that, well, they're going to make a decision every time to go to Denver, right? And so that to me is
just losing the reciprocity, the money that's supposed to be flowing back into the city.
The personal income outflow, right? And to get nerdy with it and try not to, make it overcomplicated. But basically, if you spend your money elsewhere, that money isn't being circulated.
Right.
And if we're not tracking it, if we constantly ignore it, or if we say, oh, well, let's just turn to CU and have them figure out all of our problems, then you're missing the point, right? The point is that, there needs to be competition. There needs to be disruption. And people living in Boulder may not recognize that it's even a problem because they're so used to being here. And I think that you get a really good feel for what it used to be. And it's almost sad the way the nostalgic sort of talking points come about. It's like, okay, yeah, that used to be that, but we're here like trying to do this. And I think that everything is stacked up against us. Well, let's go through what is stacked up against us and take it on head on, one by one, and really quantify the issue and provide solutions. And what we're doing is trying to spread the word about this sort of liminal space that we're in, trying to bring two sorts of boulders sort of together, the one that, is established in here and the ones that actually make it run, right? The ones who, people like you, Andrew, like people who want to be here and want to contribute to an industry or people up and coming in their tech or life science sort of spaces, right? And there's that need, that demand, and I think
There's something, right?
there's something. And so there's actually a link in the description. It's via SMS, so it's just a text. We're just a text away. Just literally, we want feedback.
Yeah.
So please give us some feedback. If you like it, great. Tell us why.
If you don't, great. Tell
turn
us
it
why.
off. No, just kidding. But really,
No, really
we
want to
your
hear from
feedback.
all voices for sure.
All right, so we're wrapping up,
Yeah, we
and
gotta
that
wrap
was
up.
episode 2. It was a good one.
Thanks, guys.